It strikes all across the country, a common bacterium with a deadly difference. This one eats the body from the inside out. It needs only 3 days to kill. And as health authorities race to stop its spread, even they can't be sure where it's coming from or who it will strike next. Harlingen, Texas, the year 2000. Marcella Lawler's 11-month-old son, Marion, had been recovering from chickenpox when he suddenly took a turn for the worst. Burning with fever, he would not stop crying. Marcella called her pediatrician, who told her to rush to the emergency room. At Valley Baptist Hospital, nurses were standing by. They hurried Marion into the ER and took blood samples for testing. The staff had no idea what was making the little boy so sick. As they worked on her son, all Marcella could do was watch.
What a parent feels is you're completely anxious and you're scared to death because at that moment we didn't know what the problem was.
But this baby had an extra ally on his side. His grandfather and namesake, Dr. Marion Lawler, was a cardiac surgeon at the hospital. Called in to examine his grandson, the doctor was astonished and alarmed. The baby's skin was red and splotchy. He had a high fever and appeared to be crashing. Dr. Lawler suspected his grandson had a serious systemic infection. The little boy's organs were beginning to fail.
From the moment I first saw him, I feared for his life. His vital signs were terrible. His heart was racing over 200 beats a minute. His respirations were shallow, 60 times a minute. Blood pressure was low. I knew he was critically ill.
His grandfather hoped the blood results would help explain the mystery. But it would take hours for them to come back. Hours his grandfather feared young Marion did not have.
Dr. Lawler said, just prepare yourself because he's going to get a lot more sick and it's going to take a lot more time for him to get better. I'm sorry. And so then I knew that he was very, very ill and that it was going to take much more time for them to stabilize him.
Dr. Lawler knew his facility didn't have the resources to treat young Marion. By this time, the young child's arm was beginning to turn blue from poor circulation. He called the Texas Children's Hospital in Houston for help.
Larry, let me tell you about my grandson. He's 11 months old. He's got bad sepsis. I don't know what's the matter, but he's got a blood clot in his right arm already. It's blue. I briefly described his condition to them, and they readily agreed that he needed to come up there as soon as possible. Okay, how soon?
Every second would count. The Children's Hospital sent a medical transport plane. The medevac plane rushed to Harlingen to pick up the child. It carried critical care nurses and pediatrician Cynthia Peacock.
We talked to the intensive care specialist in the unit, they felt that we were going to have to do some initial work on him before we could actually get him back on the plane and back to Houston. I don't think they knew the extent of it. We were worried.
But the infant was too sick to be moved right away. With his blood pressure plummeting, Dr. Peacock and her team worked to stabilize baby Marion.
He had chickenpox about 5 days ago, and it didn't bother him yet. He was getting over it.
His illness defied all their attempts, and they were running out of time. They needed to get the baby to Houston.
I would say maybe the first hour, hour and a half, that everything we did, from intubating, putting him on the ventilator, putting a central line in him, giving him blood products, he just wasn't responding. And so it was like, anything you could possibly think of to do at the time to get him out of the door. That's how we had it in our brain was, okay, one step ahead, we're going to confront this monster.
At last, they were able to move the baby out of the hospital, but their hold was tenuous. His breathing became shallow.
When Dr. Peacock came in, I kept interrupting them to tell me when the baby was going to get better. And she put her arms on my shoulders and said he was going to get a lot worse.
With no time to waste, the baby was loaded onto the plane. It was like a mobile hospital, loaded with supplies and equipment the tiny patient might require. He would need all of it. Dr. Peacock hoped he would have a chance, but then the troubles intensified.
We weren't able to take off right away because then we had to do 15 or 20 more minutes working on him in the back. And a lot of it was, can we go? My whole concern was, oh my goodness, we're going to have to turn around and go back to the hospital, go back to the intensive care unit to work on him some more. We can't go. He's not going to make it.
The crew finally managed to stabilize him enough to take off, and the plane headed for Houston. In flight, the baby's condition was precarious. With the slightest movement, his blood pressure went into a downward spiral. In order to save baby Marion, they would need a clear path to Houston.
Houston's the fourth largest city in the United States, so there's all kinds of planes coming in. We're having to tell the tower and Houston that we're coming in and we're coming in low, so you're going to have to move all of your traffic out of the way.
With time running out for baby Marion, Houston cleared all air traffic for the medevac plane. Young Marion was rushed into the intensive care unit at the Texas Children's Hospital in Houston. A swift-moving disease was ravaging the 11-month-old. His heart and lungs weren't pumping enough blood and oxygen through his body. His vital organs were in jeopardy. They thought he might be suffering from a strep infection, but they had never seen one so severe. Pediatrician Dr. Larry Jefferson and his team went right to work.
When Marion rolled into our ICU, we immediately could see he was in septic shock. His body was swollen, his face was swollen, his face was red, and we were concerned.
X-rays showed that the life-saving fluids pumped into young Marion's body were filling his lungs. The doctors had to clear his airway.
We're really filling up those lungs.
When the blood tests came back, they were definitive. Baby Marion had a severe strep infection. Doctors thought this might be related to his bout of chickenpox. The opportunistic bacteria had invaded his body through open blisters and traveled through his bloodstream. For Marcella and her husband, Marion Lawler, waiting for the prognosis was agonizing.
Difficult, I know for you, it's been difficult on that transport up. As you know, Marion was very unstable mentally. He was unstable on the plane. And the vascular space is leaking and problems keeping his blood pressure up. And the fluid is leaking through his vessels into his lung, into his tissue. we're also concerned about.
It seemed like it must have been 2 or 3 in the morning. We were retrieved by Dr. Jefferson and explained to us that Marion had chickenpox complicated by this invasive strep A bacteria, which had sent him into streptococcal toxic shock syndrome. And he'd explained to us that the antibiotics had begun working, but that the antibiotics had caused the bacteria to release a toxin that had basically perforated our son's vascular system. And I knew that that was not good at all.
Baby Marion was given a less than 1% chance of survival.
Is, of course, the shock that he's had, the continuing problem keeping.
When they told us that he might not make it, we immediately called our parents and said, you know, Marion, they're telling us he's not going to make it. It's very serious, and he probably will not make the night. And so that was, at that moment, the doctors nobody was smiling. Everybody was dead serious, and they were not giving us any signs of hope.
Dr. Jefferson briefed the child's grandfather. He told him that strep can take many dangerous forms. He feared the infection in Marion's arm could turn to necrotizing fasciitis, more commonly known as flesh-eating bacteria. This disease is extremely rare and extremely deadly.
I went to the computer laboratory and looked up specifically the toxic shock syndrome associated with beta hemolytic streptococcal infection, and that's when I really became frightened.
Dr. Lawler had to do something. Texas Children's Hospital is associated with nearby Baylor College of Medicine. At Baylor, Dr. James Musser had already studied a 1998 outbreak of invasive strep. He knew the dangers of the bacteria all too well, how it releases toxins into the blood, attacking organs and eating away flesh.
It's sort of like having rockets coming at you, each of which has a different toxin associated with it. It's a very, very clever organism, a very wily organism. That facilitates these kinds of infections.
Strep itself is all too common. Anyone who's ever had a strep throat has encountered it. But sometimes, in a few rare cases, a virulent strain of the bacteria will cause severe disease. Perhaps the most terrifying manifestation is necrotizing fasciitis, known as flesh-eating bacteria, the disease that literally eats away human flesh. Dr. Edward Kaplan at the University of Minnesota keeps a database of strep A patients for the World Health Organization.
Many of the patients who develop toxic shock and necrotizing fasciitis, they've had some kind of injury. It almost seems as if the organism tends to gravitate to areas of damaged tissue.
As baby Marion's condition worsened, doctors feared there was little they could do to stop this terrifying disease from taking his young life. In the year 2000, a toxic bacteria was threatening the life of baby Marion Lawler. As the child fought for his life, Marion's parents could only watch and hope as the doctors did all they could.
Dr. Jefferson came in and he said that he had been working with him, that he had pushed an unbelievable amount of blood into him, that his blood pressure was extremely low, that his heart rate was extremely high, that everything was not the way it's supposed to be, and that he was not responding.
As Marion Lawler clung to life, doctors in Texas began to draw on information they had learned from dealing with this disease for over 2 years. In 1998, Austin, Texas saw an alarming number of severe strep infections. Cases of invasive strep are rare, but when they show up, it's usually in a cluster. One of the largest and deadliest outbreaks ever had occurred in Austin, Texas, just 2 years earlier. In 1998, Tom Hastings came to the emergency room of an Austin area hospital. He had been suffering for 2 days with headaches, exhaustion, low-grade fever, and a dry cough.
I've been worse for a couple days.
He thought he had the flu and went to the hospital only when he started spitting up blood and finding more blood in his urine. By then, he was already in serious danger. Doctors in Austin admitted him to the hospital and diagnosed him with a bacterial infection. They began a course of antibiotics immediately. But before the drugs had a chance to work, his lungs began filling with fluid. Blood tests indicated he had something much worse than the flu. An invasive strep infection was destroying his lungs, causing a life-threatening case of pneumonia. As doctors were trying to treat Hastings, 43-year-old truck driver Dan Cooper woke up to discover something terrible on his side. Strep toxins caused blood vessels under his skin to burst, leaving a large blister.
Hey, how you doing?
Dan hurried into the ER.
Hang on, let me just take a look at this for a second.
The doctor immediately recognized the
sorry.
danger.
It is painful,
It's
huh?
sore.
Okay.
It's unbelievably sore.
It looks like we're gonna have to do some surgery.
Yeah, I better call my girlfriend.
Antibiotics alone would not stop the runaway infection. Dan was quickly prepped for surgery. He was diagnosed with a devastating strep infection that was eating away his flesh at the rate of 1 inch per hour. The doctor would have to cut away the infected tissue before more of his body was destroyed. Once the strep bacteria infects the flesh, the infected areas must be removed to stop its aggressive spread. As the bacteria advanced towards Dan's genitals, abdomen, and trunk, doctors kept cutting. Over the next 5 days, he endured 6 surgeries. Between each one, Dan spent time in the pressurized atmosphere of a hyperbaric chamber, the same kind divers use for the bends. They hoped that the pure oxygen of the chamber would inhibit the growth of the bacteria and the production of toxins, as well as accelerate the healing process.
If you have any problems equalizing your ears.
It was a last resort, an attempt to stop the devastating effects of this predatory bacteria. While doctors waited to see whether Dan Cooper would recover, Tom Hastings, who had come to the emergency room complaining of flu-like symptoms, suffered fatal cardiac arrest.
Let's get some epinephrine started, please. We in?
Epinephrine in.
Okay. And no pulse.
The bacteria had lodged in his lungs, causing severe pneumonia. At the Austin Travis County Health Department, Betty Vickers had received other reports of sudden deaths.
We usually have 1 or 2 cases a year of this where people might die, but we had 2 fairly healthy individuals that died within a short period of time of each other, and we figured that there was something going on at that time.
This deadly disease was on the upswing, and Betty Vickers needed to know why. The state health department reported they had seen a rise in deaths due to invasive strep infections all across Texas.
We knew we had a problem. There was no question about it at that time. We had to do something to help protect the community.
Betty Vickers had to find out where the flesh-eating bacteria was coming from before she could hope to stop it.
He was fine at night. He just woke up.
Vickers tried to find a common connection between the victims by interviewing their spouses and co-workers.
Fever, coughing. So I took
What she found was a mystery begging to be solved.
No, he was very healthy.
We could not find any commonalities among these cases. They were different ages, different parts of town, different backgrounds, different cultures. We couldn't find any link between these people. Nothing.
And still, the victims kept coming. The Texas Health Department pored over the data on strep infections from hospitals across the state. Between December 1997 and mid-February 1998, the Health Department confirmed 27 cases of invasive Group A strep. 10 Texans had died. The cases clustered in central Texas near Austin. Still, no connection could be made between the victims. The disease was striking young and old. A little girl in the Austin area also succumbed to the strep bacteria. Nurses went to the little girl's daycare center to take throat cultures of the other children and staff to see if they carried the deadly bacteria.
Open up real wide and stick your tongue out.
They provided antibiotics to anyone who came in contact with the child.
Stick it out for me. Hold your head up. I've been in the business for a long time, many years, and usually there's a vaccine or something, you know, how you can protect yourself. But you could go to the grocery store and not know if you were exposed or not, and it was scary.
The bacterium causing the disease was extremely common. At any given time, up to 20% of the population anywhere may carry the Streptococcus A bacterium without any symptoms at all. The danger arises when the strep mutates and becomes invasive. Texas health officials raced to find out why this deadly mutation was hitting their state so hard. The community had questions too. Public health officials set up a hotline and fielded thousands of calls. The public was in a panic.
One day we had over 500 phone calls, and our poor support person was, all they were able to do is say, give me your name and phone number and I'll have a nurse call you back.
At Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, microbiologist James Musser analyzed bacteria samples collected from victims all across the state. He was looking to find out what was making this common bacteria turn into a killer. He identified many different strains of Group A strep popping up all over Texas. But the most lethal ones were found in the Austin area. Musser's team began trying to crack the genetic codes of the deadly forms of strep.
The strategy of genome analysis is a crucial strategy now in our studies of how Group A Streptococcus causes human disease. It's now important to investigate many of the other common serotypes that cause both invasive disease and Group A strep in order to determine exactly what factors are specific to the strains that cause the flesh-eating syndrome.
Each strep bacterium contains 1.9 million pairs of chemical bases, the genetic instructions for its behavior. The strains of killer strep and the harmless forms are more than 90% identical. Musser's research focused on the other 10%, the genetic material found only in the deadly strains. Most important were the genes that held the bacterium's orders to kill. Musser's goal was to stop those orders. But even as Musser worked to understand the bacteria, the public continued to become ill. The killer strep could invade the body through a scratch or abrasion. Caught early enough, it could be treated with antibiotics, but it was seldom caught in time. In Texas, victims continued to pay with life and limb. As health officials worked tirelessly to stop its spread, the killer bacteria continued its advance against a helpless population.
Clear. Try one more time.
Despite the doctor's best efforts, a third victim died of catastrophic organ failure as the Group A strep bacteria swept through his body. This killer seemed unstoppable, and despite the hours that researchers were putting in, no one had any idea of where to start. Invasive Group A strep had taken hold of Texas, and one of its tiniest victims was putting up the biggest fight. "11-month-old Marion Lawler IV suffered the many horrors of strep infection. Not only was he enduring strep-induced toxic shock, but he also fought a case of streptococcal pneumonia.
He was not oxygenating his blood sufficiently, and they placed him on a special respirator called the oscillating ventilator that breathes 640 breaths a minute. And even the initial days of that, the pressures were high and the oxygen level was low, and he was barely hanging on with that ventilator.
Doctors pumped the child full of fluids to try to combat the infection. The drastic life-preserving methods rendered the infant unrecognizable, even to his father.
It was terrible. He was already grotesquely disfigured from the volume overload. We could not recognize him. He looked to be 3 times the size that he was before, and he was purple.
As young Marion Lawler lingered near death, he had an ally. His grandfather, a physician, reached out for help. He contacted Dennis Stevens at the VA hospital in Boise, Idaho. Over the years, Stevens had become the leading authority on invasive Group A strep. He knew exactly how dangerous this adversary was. He was one of the first to recognize deadly new strains, one of the first to declare it a potential time bomb.
The organism has the ability to adapt. It has the ability to acquire new virulence factors. Group A strep doubles about every 23 minutes. Its ability to adapt is hundreds, if not thousands times greater than that of the human host.
One particular donor is nearly twice as high as the other two, so yeah, we may see some very significant differences in the recruits from San Diego.
Dr. Stevens recognized the gravity of young Marion's condition. He was the first to alert the medical community that strep bacteria could cause toxic shock in healthy young people.
Rapid demise patients.
Pure Group A strep.
In his 20 years of experience with the disease, he had seen a growing number of cases in patients around the world.
We had a case over in eastern Idaho. Kid was out berry picking, developed a scar.
The reason that people develop these deep-seated infections are that they encounter an organism to which they don't have natural resistance. They don't have antibodies against the organism itself or some of the toxins it produces.
3 or 4 hours later,
But Dr. Stevens had also begun to develop a way to combat the disease. It all started with an Idaho lawyer named Brad Andrews.
Brad Andrews was a very healthy young man, played handball and racquetball. He acquired an abrasion on his elbow, and about 24 to 36 hours later, he developed a tremendous swelling about the elbow with red skin and streaks up his arm.
Brad didn't realize it, but he was seeing the first signs of the potentially fatal infection.
I went to work, and it was probably 3 to 4 hours later, and the symptoms were continually getting worse.
He drove himself to the hospital and was immediately admitted.
The first night I was in the hospital, they told me that my blood pressure dropped very low, and I asked him, I said, what's going on? And he said, he goes, I don't know, but if you don't get your blood pressure up, you could die.
Brad was fortunate that his wife worked for Dr. Stevens. She knew how bad the disease could be. She also knew that the doctor had begun developing a new drug treatment for the disease. Brad would be one of the first to try it out.
We looked at the ability of clindamycin to suppress toxin production in vitro, in test tubes, and it was a very potent inhibitor of the toxin. And we thought that that might be a reasonable agent to use to treat these potent toxin-producing strains of Group A strep.
Feeling okay?
Brad was switched to the antibiotic clindamycin to stop the toxin and combat the lethal infection. And within days, he began to get better. The treatment given early had worked. Dr. Stevens told Marion's grandfather about clindamycin. Dr. Lawler realized every piece of information he gathered could save his grandson's life. The young boy's father was desperate for anything to help his son.
Really, we were living every second of every single day for our son. Any change in his blood pressure, 1 degree or the other, change in his temperature, in his urine output, in his breathing capabilities, we were really hanging on by a thread at that point. First week or two, the news just seemed to be getting worse and worse and worse.
Marion was now being kept under a heated blanket to try to stabilize his body temperature and combat further infection. He was in desperate need of a medical miracle. At the Texas Children's Hospital in 2000, little Marion Lawler was in danger. He had been medevaced to Houston, rushed into intensive care, only for his parents to learn he faced a life-threatening infection, the invasive form of Strep A. But now the research of his grandfather and the lessons learned from other strep patients would begin to pay off. The baby was given a full spectrum of antibiotics, including clindamycin, to fight the lethal bacteria. Finally, the infant began to stabilize.
With Streptococcus invasive A, the most important thing is that they make it the first 72 hours. So for us to make it those 3 days was, we were actually happy. He made it, he's gonna get better. And then his kidney shut down. And then he gets the pneumonia. Then we think he might lose the arm.
It took the constant vigilance of the Lawler family and an army of doctors and nurses to keep the infant's body functioning at its most basic level.
There were about 19 different pediatric specialists that were involved in his evaluation or his treatment in some capacity.
The Federal Centers for Disease Control and Prevention had found that of the more than 100 strains or variations of the group A strep, 2 were found to be most life-threatening, M1 and M3. The CDC found that these strains were more likely to be fatal, more likely to cause dangerous clusters of cases, like the one in Austin. The Austin area had become a boomtown, and public health nurse Betty Vickers feared the unusual strep was the downside of the city's success.
At that time, this area was having a significant growth, population increase. We don't know if that's how it was introduced or not, but you can kind of suspect or think that way.
Public health officials believe the influx of new residents from across the country might have introduced the new strains of strep. The locals had no resistance. This is how the scientists believed that victims like Dan Cooper and baby Marion Lawler had become infected. But despite having some luck with treatments, they were still looking for a cure. The doctors continued to gather research from all over the world. Information on a new form of treatment came from thousands of miles away. Doctors in Canada were reporting they could reduce invasive strep fatalities. In Toronto, Kathy Mulville led a busy life with her husband and young daughter. She seldom let a cold bother her. But one morning in 1994, she felt particularly ill.
I went to bed one night after having some family over for a birthday party and woke up in the morning feeling as if I had the flu. And I also had a really severe pain in my right arm. To me, it actually felt like it was also down part of my back.
Kathy hoped it would pass, but by the next day, she only felt worse. Pain relievers weren't working on her sore arm. She grew concerned that she was suffering from more than the flu.
Yes. Let's go ahead and take your temperature.
Kathy went to the doctor, but her strange collection of symptoms did not present a clear diagnosis.
The physician said that she couldn't find any reason for the extreme pain, that she was concerned about it. So she said, you know, if you wake up in the middle of the night and you're afraid, go to the emergency department and explain to them what's been happening to you over the last few days.
That night, she went to the hospital. By the time she got to the emergency room, her kidneys were shutting down. Her white blood cell count rose, indicating a severe infection as her throat and chest began to swell. She was rushed to the ICU. Diagnosis: massive infection. Cause: unknown.
Apparently the resident who was on duty called around the country trying to figure out what was wrong with me and got in touch with Dr. Lowe at Mount Sinai Hospital.
The resident described the symptoms to strep expert Donald Lowe, who suspected that Kathy's toxic shock might have been caused by group A strep.
So tell me a bit about how he's
If that were true, her prognosis looked grim.
We told the family that, in fact, the likelihood of her dying from this illness was about an 80% chance. We wanted her transferred to Mount Sinai Hospital, so not only could we institute the appropriate therapy, but also carry out the appropriate surgery.
On Dr. Lowe's orders, Kathy was rushed to the better-equipped hospital. They had to remove the infected flesh before the deadly bacteria spread too far. But surgery was just the beginning. With Kathy's life on the line, Dr. Lowe decided to try a brand new treatment they had been experimenting with. It was called immunoglobulin therapy. Delivering a concentrated version of the body's own antibodies, the therapy was thought to inactivate the dangerous strep toxins. Kathy would be one of the very first to get it for invasive strep.
Once we recognized that Kathy likely had streptococcal toxic shock, we instituted the appropriate antibiotics, that is penicillin and clindamycin. And we also instituted high-dose antibodies, that is intravenous immune globulin.
Intravenous immunoglobulin was a therapy that had been used to treat other illnesses, but had barely been used for streptococcal toxic shock. But even if the treatment worked, the bacteria already had too much of a head start. No life-saving drugs could reach her already dead tissue. Surgeons continued to cut out the infected portions of her flesh in a race to stop the spread of the strep toxins. And all they could do was hope the immunoglobulin therapy would work. In Texas, little Marion Lawler had been critically ill for several weeks. Diagnosed with invasive strep, given a less than 1 in 100 chance of survival, he was treated with massive doses of antibiotics. And slowly, he began to pull through. After a month of intensive care, he was taken off the ventilator and began to breathe on his own.
And then the day, of course, he was off the ventilator, it was just a wonderful, very happy, very happy.
Baby Marion was on the road to recovery. But even if you recover, invasive strep can leave its mark. Kathy Mulvale had endured 8 operations to remove the invasive strep that had devoured the tissue of her arm and shoulder. But each surgery revealed that the bacteria had spread much more than suspected.
Originally, they'd been just going to the front of my one arm, and what they did is they made an incision from the base of my elbow all the way up the back of my arm, across my armpit, and then halfway over to my spine. And what they found in there was 11 necrotic muscles, so 11 rotten muscles, and they removed all of those and then took out half of my shoulder blade as well.
By the time the necrotizing fasciitis was identified, it already had a 3-day head start. Luckily, Dr. Lowe's innovative immunoglobulin therapy, pumping up the body's own defenses, turned out to work well, and Kathy began to recover. To Dr. Lowe, catching an invasive strep infection early on is vital to a successful recovery.
One of the great difficulties with this disease is making an early, correct diagnosis. And often when physicians first see a patient, they don't suspect the illness. In fact, 30% were misdiagnosed. Today, that problem still exists because the symptoms are so nondescript and often associated with a flu-like illness, pain, myalgias, sore joints, fever, that group A strep is not even suspected as a cause of their symptoms.
Dr. Donald Lowe's research team in Canada dedicated themselves to early detection and learning how the disease gets passed from one person to another. A carrier might not even realize he or she is infected. In Kathy Mulvale's case, family members carried the same dangerous strain of group A strep, while presenting different symptoms or no symptoms at all.
Always one of the questions is, what's the likelihood of someone else who's had contact with a patient with severe streptococcal disease? What's the likelihood that they'll come down with infection? Family members, patients that were in contact with family members or other individuals for more than 4 hours a day in the previous week, they were in fact at greater risk of developing severe streptococcal disease.
In trying to determine how she caught the disease, Kathy recalled a small cut on her little finger, hardly noticeable,
Goodness, would you please cover your mouth when you cough? Here's a tissue.
but an open invitation for the bacteria to invade.
Tissue next time, okay?
The theory is that one of the children coughed, got bacteria on their hand, and then held my hand. The bacteria worked its way in through the cut and then up into the soft tissue in my shoulder, where I had perhaps torn a muscle using this new ski machine, and that's where all the damage began.
Today, Kathy Mulvale is living a full and healthy life. She started an organization to help spread the word about the dangers of the strep bacteria. Her organization produced a brochure called a Life Guide to help people recognize the symptoms and severity of the disease, and to persuade their doctors to consider it as a possible diagnosis.
A parent or a patient or a husband or spouse can go into a physician and say, this is what we're experiencing right now. Is it possible that this person has necrotizing fasciitis? And for a physician to recognize necrotizing fasciitis is very difficult. If they've never seen it before, they will think that you have a pain of some sort and that you have the flu, and they will send you home. But the Life Guide, you can confidently them on whether or not that's what you have.
Patients in Texas have benefited from Kathy's experience and Dr. Lowe's immunoglobulin therapy. Dan Cooper has made a full recovery. Dan and little Marion were among the lucky ones. In just the first 5 months of 1998, Texas had 232 cases of invasive strep A. In less than 6 months, 33 people died. A third of them were children. Today, the CDC reports as many as 1,500 deaths are caused yearly by the invasive Group A strep bacteria. To prevent this type of devastating outbreak, Dr. James Dale and his team at the University of Tennessee are working to create a vaccine. He is combining proteins from 26 different strains of Group A strep. Thanks to research in genomes, Dr. Dale and others can select the bacterial proteins that will, it's hoped, cause antibody production without causing illness, and guard against the disease.
This vaccine was designed to protect against 80 to 90% of those serotypes that are responsible for serious invasive disease, and also 80 to 90% of those types that cause uncomplicated strep throat. We believe that the vaccine will have a significant impact on the entire burden of streptococcal disease.
You better get in the bowl.
The vaccine could prevent thousands of cases like that of baby Marion Lawler. Now 4, he has made a complete recovery and enjoys a happy, healthy life.
In my work as a cardiovascular surgeon, when I do a bypass or other surgical procedure, it's generally on someone 60 or 70 years old, and so I may provide them an additional 10, 12, 15 years of life. But when you save a child 1 year old, you're giving him his entire life.
The bacteria still mystifies. The disease still threatens. But now that gift of life may be within our grasp. A mysterious organism prowls the waters of North Carolina. Victims find their skin burning. Then they begin to fear they are losing their minds. Even the scientists studying the organism succumb. Health officials rush to close rivers and beaches. They must track down the mysterious source of this dangerous sickness before it's too late. The Carolina coastline, a watery wilderness teeming with life. Fishermen Seth Willis and David Jones had worked North Carolina's Neuse and Pamlico rivers all their lives. But not too long ago, they began to notice something strange.
Well, we've seen better days.
At certain times of the year, when they were on the water, David Jones felt nauseous and lightheaded.
Buddy, I'm gonna have to let you handle it. I don't feel bad, real bad.
It always passed, and mostly they didn't worry about it.
I'll be all right, man.
One day in 1995, though, it didn't pass. In fact, it got worse.
Make it to the dock, I'll be doing good.
When the men turned to head home, they ran into a problem. Neither one could remember which way was home.
Hey, going the wrong way.
It was a clear day, and they knew the Neuse River like the backs of their hands. But on this day, nothing looked familiar. They were disoriented, confused.
Got billions of sun. Get back home.
They motored in circles for hours, trying to fix on a familiar landmark, as David Jones recalls.
Out of the clear blue, you don't recognize the landmark. You don't recognize where you're at. It's a weird feeling. I was lost within myself.
After hours of riding around aimlessly, they finally came upon their boat ramp. But their thoughts and actions just got more and more jumbled.
We were trying to put the boat on the trailer. Very, very simple operation. Just like putting your pants on when you get up. That's it, that's it. No daggone. The only problem is, can't focus to get it on the trailer. Almost 3.5 hours. That's it. Babe, you should have been with me.
When he got home, David Jones described the incident to his wife.
We got sick. We got lost.
And it's got to be the
Margaret Jones had been seeing a lot of changes in her husband.
I got real scared and I worried, and I would ask him, don't you think you need to see a doctor? I'm not going to see a doctor.
It's throwing my money away.
The more he stayed out on the water, the worse he got.
Is your lesions and rash getting worse and worse and worse?
As David and his partner Seth Willis compared symptoms, they found they both had begun to develop lesions, sores on their arms that didn't heal properly.
The lesions started appearing at the top of the glove where it touched the skin. This one, 7 months. Finally healed. The lesions began not healing, but more appearing.
Just going out in the water is going to make it come back.
There's a little something going on, but you can't quite put your finger on it.
The men noticed the lesions flared up whenever they were working on the water.
Oh, no. Looky there. Oh, man. Check this out. Yeah. Look at that.
Not only that, the fish they were handling also had lesions.
Look at yours. Same way. Yeah. Same way.
Finally, David's symptoms got so bad, he decided to make the trip to the doctor.
Could you tell me what happened precisely?
When he could not even get out what his thoughts were, I didn't know if he was having a nervous breakdown. I just didn't know because he just was not acting rational. And he kept saying, you know, I feel like my skin's crawling. He said, I feel like there's something that's crawling around in my skin. And I couldn't understand. I said, well, maybe, you know, you've got an allergy or you're itching or something, you know, because sometimes you feel like your skin's itching. He said, no, it feels like something is in my skin crawling around.
Been out there
The doctor couldn't find any medical explanation for David's symptoms. He suggested that he contact a scientist in Raleigh who was conducting a study on fishermen with similar mental and physical problems. Her name was Joanne Burkholder. As the director of the Center for Applied Aquatic Ecology at North Carolina State University, Joanne Burkholder is a marine ecologist who had been hearing about a mysterious illness that was plaguing fishermen like David Jones.
I was on the North Carolina Marine Fisheries Commission, and so I interacted with a lot of fishermen in our state, especially coastal folk. And I began to just quietly ask them, have you ever had any problems when you've been out on the water? Do you ever get sick? Has ever any funny things happen?
David, this is Dr. Joanne Burkholder. This is my husband, David Jones.
The doctor traveled to New Bern and met with David and Margaret Jones.
Very severe. Matter of fact,
By the time that I met David Jones, he had burning eyes, burning skin, couldn't breathe. He wasn't talking very well. He had serious bouts of memory problems.
She knew Jones needed help. Burkholder suggested he see a doctor at the Duke University Medical Center's Neurological Disorders Clinic. Dr. Donald Schmeckel specializes in hard-to-treat neurological cases.
His presenting symptoms basically make you think of the nervous system. He was having difficulty reading. He was having some difficulties in emotions and thinking. He also had some indication of widespread body type of changes. His liver functions jumped a bit. He had a skin rash. So the sky's the limit there. Do you have a systemic medical illness that's affecting the nervous system indirectly, or is the nervous system the issue? When you have a skin rash, you have to argue that not only the nervous system, but the rest of his body was also being affected by the exposures.
All right, we're going to have him just lay back here. Watch your neck.
The first step was for David Jones to have a CAT scan.
That fit all right in there?
The results were not good. The scans showed David had suffered serious neurological damage. He had an injury deep within the left temporal lobe of his brain, the area linked to memory and language. But the doctor had no idea what was causing it.
he was telling me my body was degenerating daily, and there was nothing they could do to stop it.
Whatever was attacking David Jones's body wasn't only affecting fishermen. Joanne Burkholder had gotten sick herself. In the course of working with fish from these North Carolina rivers, she had come down with symptoms just like Jones's.
There were problems that crept up on us, but I did write them off. Sore throat. It must just be a virus, or headaches. It must be stress. Shortness of breath, asthma-like symptoms must be allergy.
And it wasn't the first time. A couple of years earlier, Burkholder had been studying similar water samples with diseased fish when she had a strange reaction.
I had been putting my hands into aquaria to get beakers of water to put into different containers for this experiment. And I would hold the beaker close to my face.
She began to feel faint and disoriented. She needed to get out of the lab.
I doubled over. I had severe stomach cramping and realized I wasn't breathing very well and had asthma-like attack.
Outside, the fresh air seemed to relieve the symptoms. But Burkholder wasn't going back into that lab. She went home instead.
And I don't remember much else for about 8 days, except that I would have periods in which I could realize something was really wrong. It was really a very frightening experience.
She called in sick with the flu, but her symptoms suggested something quite different. For a week, her memory seemed to fade in and out of focus.
I realized that I couldn't hold a conversation, so I hid. and I stayed in my apartment for about 8 days. And as I began to come out of it, I tested myself by watching a newscast and then seeing if I could write down a simple sentence that someone had said.
After more than a week at home, Burkholder felt well enough to get back to work in the lab. Now she was determined to try to find out what made her so sick. She had been studying a class of single-celled organisms called dinoflagellates, or dinos.
They're primitive, so-called. That is, they have been on Earth for a long, long time. They're considered among the oldest of the types of organisms with nuclei in their cells. So they've probably been around for literally 500 or 800 million years. However, they're not really very primitive in some respects. They have had a lot of time to evolve complex chemical interactions with other animals.
On the day she became so ill, she had just started working with one specific organism, a tiny predator known as Pfiesteria. As this one-celled killer morphs through as many as 24 life stages, it becomes more and more deadly. In fact, it had recently been linked to massive fish kills along the Carolina waterways. Exactly why, no one knew. But Pfiesteria seemed to thrive where the rivers meet the sea, in coastal estuaries where salt and fresh water mix. The signs of its presence in the tidal basins of the Neuse and Pamlico rivers were alarming.
Pfiesteria is a generalist. It eats just about everything and anything. It eats dead material, live material, but its favorite source of food is fish.
Like a microscopic Jekyll and Hyde, most of the time Pfiesteria was a benign little organism, lying dormant in the silt at the bottom of estuaries. But in the presence of fish, something would trigger it to grow many times its size, sprouting tentacles and potentially releasing a venomous toxin that paralyzes its prey. The Pfiesteria's toxin was so powerful, it could literally peel the flesh from the fish's bodies. In short, Pfiesteria was transformed into the perfect killing machine. Scientists feared that this newly discovered organism might also be attacking humans. They had to find out, and soon. In the coastal waters of North Carolina, a strange organism was possibly attacking fish, killing them and eating away their flesh within minutes. Humans who worked the waterways were also developing large skin lesions, loss of motor skills, and memory problems.
Same thing.
Mr. Jones?
It was an illness that was plaguing many fishermen, like David Jones.
I'm sick, I'm not feeling well, and I can't get the most important question answered. What is happening? No one can answer this question.
At the North Carolina Center for Applied Aquatic Ecology, Dr. Joanne Burkholder's research team searched for answers. It seemed to her that Pfiesteria might be more dangerous than anyone knew. It might be targeting humans. Watermen were the most common victims, but Burkholder's staff was also suffering. Howard Glasgow is a marine ecologist who had worked closely with Joanne Burkholder on Pfiesteria for years. He also experienced some strange symptoms while researching the organism.
I just, got this really euphoric feeling. Stood up and it was like my mind was rushing 1,000 miles an hour, but my body was moving like moonwalking, really slow. And it's kind of the out-of-body experience, if you will. I head on my way home I was at that time living about a half an hour away. It took me about 3 hours to get home. Evidently, I was wandering aimlessly around.
Hey everyone.
With a dozen lab workers sick, the university had no choice.
Unfortunately, going to have to share with you.
They closed the lab until it could be made safe, stopping all work with Pfiesteria for over a year.
All of our cultures were destroyed because they just couldn't survive a year and a half of dormancy, so we couldn't get them back up and functioning. We basically had to start all over.
In June 1995, a biohazard level 3 laboratory was opened. It was divided into two sides, a vented contained so-called hot side for working with toxic agents, and a separate cold side for everyday offices. Once Burkholder was satisfied that the design of the new facility would greatly minimize the risks of exposure to lethal organisms, the research into Pfiesteria resumed. Samples were regrown. Airborne Pfiesteria was never known to affect humans, and Burkholder set out to answer two key questions. Exactly how did it affect humans, and what could be done to stop it? She called on the National Ocean Service in Charleston, South Carolina for help. John Ramsdell and Peter Moeller are two of the leading experts on marine toxicology in the world. Burkholder sent the lab a sample of Pfiesteria, and the men went to work trying to isolate what made it so dangerous. Peter Moeller knew what he was being asked to do was nearly impossible.
It's like looking for a needle in the haystack, but we don't know what the needle looks like. We have to start partitioning this haystack, throwing out all the stuff we recognize as hay, and testing everything else. And then we have to slowly build up what we determine to be the active constituent. We don't know what it looks like.
Is this Pfiesteria grown with fish or without fish? No, this is stuff grown with algae or without fish.
The scientists' first challenge was trying to identify and isolate the toxin from the Pfiesteria itself. Toxin samples were dissolved in a solvent and then isolated using a controlled evaporation process.
Same toxin without fish. That's correct. Oh, that's wonderful. So
once they isolated it, they next sought to learn how it worked.
That's just great.
In the lab, they studied how specialized cells reacted to the presence of the toxin.
John, look what I found. I did a quick scan. It's for the Pfiesteria fraction Jen just received.
Where is the activity?
It's fraction 6, 7, 8.
We probe inside the cells to look at the type of biochemical mechanisms that are occurring. And it's from this information that physicians can better understand how this toxin causes the adverse effects, say on memory processing, say on formation of lesions on the skin.
About 22.5 minutes after I've added the toxic fraction.
What they found was a dangerous substance that acted in frightening ways. Ramsdell and Moeller used their research to gain insight into the possibility of the Pfiesteria toxin adversely affecting immune system and brain functions.
So that fish isn't moving at all.
Now that they were beginning to understand what the Pfiesteria toxin did, these researchers wanted to see just how aggressive it was. What different kinds of cells would it attack? In researching fish kills, they tested how it responded to different types of blood. It didn't seem interested in frozen chicken blood. But when they gave it human blood, what they found was startling.
It is incredibly aggressive and loves to attack. And indeed, after providing it with human blood, we saw that it aggressively ate the human blood just as aggressively as it did the fish blood.
The Pfiesteria moved from cell to cell like vampires, breaking down and devouring the blood cells. They were ravenous, and their favorite food seemed to come from humans. Scientists were in a race to find something to stop them. In 1995, North Carolina researchers were working to find the source of a mysterious illness. They had been examining an aggressive microorganism and a potentially dangerous toxin that was linked to the slaughtering of fish populations. Now they feared this organism was also targeting humans. At a North Carolina aquatics lab, a new facility had just been built to safely contain dangerous organisms. The Pfiesteria toxin was confined in a biohazard level 3 containment area. Marine ecologist Howard Glasgow's work area was in the safe zone, yet he was still showing mysterious symptoms.
I would have conversations with people and walking out of the room and coming back in and not having even remembered having the conversation or being there, and argue with them about not having been there and tell them that they were crazy when actually it was me that was actually having the problem.
The lab technicians feared that somehow the toxin might have become airborne and was leaking out of the containment area into the offices. If that was the case, they needed to find the source of the problem fast. They feared something might be wrong with the ventilation system and conducted a smoke test. Smoke was introduced into the vent system to see how the air from the work area was being processed. All the smoke should have been vented to the outside.
Good luck. They can go in the other room and check
But
out.
when they went to check Glasgow's office, their worst fears were confirmed. An improperly installed ventilation system was sending air from the toxic hot room directly to the vent above Glasgow's desk.
So naturally, he sustained a lot of exposure and thought he'd been working in perfectly safe conditions.
Howard's case led to theories from the researchers that Pfiesteria did not just strike through the water. Its toxin could possibly cause illness even when airborne. That was something fisherman David Jones already knew. No longer working on the water, he still grappled with his mysterious symptoms.
I can be less than 800 yards from the water, and my skin will sometimes itch. My eyes start watering. A headache comes on. You know something is present because it is affecting your senses.
Burkholder's team turned their attention to the Neuse River, where David Jones and other fishermen were getting sick. They now thought that if the Pfiesteria was concentrated in the water, it could easily become airborne and endanger people across the state.
As the wind picks up, that can cause the water molecules to get into the air, and the water molecules would have attached to them potentially Pfiesteria toxin.
Back at the lab, water samples were prepared for examination. The water was in fact teeming with Pfiesteria. If the Pfiesteria toxin became airborne, researchers feared it could infect thousands of people living, working, and playing along the waterways of North Carolina. The implications were chilling. And that was just the start. In fact, the researchers thought they were facing a much larger problem, since Pfiesteria was not just confined to North Carolina. "200 miles north in the Chesapeake Bay, the watermen of Maryland were witnessing something terrible. The water was covered with fish, thousands of dead fish, with sores and ugly lesions, and tails that had been eaten away. And the Maryland watermen were also getting sick. Dave Morley had been fishing the Chesapeake region for years. In the last year, he'd begun developing chronic memory lapses, along with red, festering sores on his arms. His strange symptoms sent him to the office of his family physician.
Hey, Doc. Good afternoon.
Dr. Richie Shoemaker of Pocomoke, Maryland, noticed a lot of watermen coming into his office with lesions covering their arms and legs.
And you've been sick for how many years?
They were also complaining that they were losing their minds.
Memory loss is a big thing.
These illnesses don't follow the pattern of anything that we have seen before. Pretty early on, it was clear that as a family practitioner, I didn't have background in any of the many different sciences that were coming to bear. And I didn't know what was going on. So my fear was that I would not be able to help.
Shoemaker became very concerned. He began doing his own research and found that North Carolina was experiencing the same problems with fish and watermen linked to an organism called Pfiesteria. One name kept popping up, Joanne Burkholder.
Yeah, my name is Rich Shoemaker. I'm a family practice physician, Pocomoke, Maryland.
Contacting Burkholder, he found striking similarities between his patients and the fishermen she had documented.
Human illness, we've got some very unusual skin lesions. They're not like anything that I've seen before.
A sample of water from Maryland was sent down to the North Carolina Aquatics Lab. Technicians there identified Pfiesteria microbes present in the water from the Chesapeake Bay. The results confirmed Dr. Shoemaker's worst fears. The dangerous toxin was also infesting Maryland's waters. In 1995, a newly discovered microbe had surfaced along the coast of North Carolina. It had been linked to the killing of millions of fish and was now thought to be preying on the men who worked the waters. In Maryland, hundreds of miles away, the same organism had been detected. But the discovery had not yet been made public. Little did anyone know that one influential fisherman on a weekend excursion would break the story wide open.
Think you're gonna catch anything today?
Maryland Governor Paris Glendenning was out fishing with his son.
Oh, look at that, look at that.
They caught a rockfish just north of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel.
Oh yeah, that's a big one. Oh yeah, oh yeah.
But their excitement soon turned to horror as they discovered it was covered with lesions.
I gotta tell you, they were gross. I mean, it was almost like either acid or a worm or something had bored, in some cases, all the way through the fish. The health of the fish was not good at all. And it was clear, we have serious problems.
And the problem just kept getting bigger. Weeks later, 10,000 fish were found floating dead at the mouth of the Pocomoke River in Maryland. Dr. Richie Shoemaker's small practice was becoming overwhelmed with patients. All of them had eerily similar complaints. skin lesions, confusion, memory loss, headaches, fatigue, burning eyes and throats.
Physteria was the first illness that we found to be acquired from environmental exposure to a compound made by a living creature, a biologically produced neurotoxin. These illnesses don't follow the pattern of anything that we have seen before.
In Maryland, like North Carolina, fishermen weren't the only ones affected. Yvonne Lawson was a researcher who was documenting the fish kills.
We're going to do a little eye test of visual contrast.
After working with the fish for several months, she began suffering memory loss and more.
Respiratory problems. I had no concentration whatsoever. I couldn't read, couldn't carry on a conversation.
Right.
If I don't write it down, it won't get done. That's why I write notes and why I live with a pocket full of notes.
Take another look at number 6 right here.
In Shoemaker's small practice, he identified 60 patients with what he believed was severe exposure to Pfiesteria. Officials now knew they were dealing with a full-blown epidemic. Eager to document the effects of Pfiesteria, they decided to push the case up to the state level. A panel of doctors headed by Dr. Glenn Morris from the University of Maryland School of Medicine and Johns Hopkins traveled to Pocomoke to examine firsthand a group of patients identified by the Public Health Department, including the patients of Dr. Shoemaker.
We got kind of piled into a beat-up health department van to go down to the Pocomoke River. And on the way down, I delivered a short lecture on hysterical reactions and talked about the fact that our goal was to try to provide reassurance from a public health standpoint that there wasn't anything going on. As it turned out, it didn't exactly work out that way.
What the physicians saw startled them.
Marley, good morning. Hey, Doc.
These patients could not be classified as having hysterical reactions. In fact, all 13 patients they examined had skin lesions, some memory loss, and learning difficulties associated with exposure to Pfiesteria-infested water.
Why don't you come right this way, Mr. Morley? We're going to be in exam room 3 this afternoon.
Okay.
Go right in and have a seat.
Dr. Lynn Gratton, a neuropsychologist from the University of Maryland, was asked to measure cognitive functions of the patients.
We have Mr. Morley with us today. The watermen that we had a chance to meet with were frightened. They were anxious. They were worrying about how this was going to impact their ability to work, to make a living, whether or not it was reversible, whether or not they'd get better. Take these pegs, which are shaped like little keys with a round side and a flat side, and place them using your right
She initially thought it would take about 15 minutes per patient for the evaluations.
as I'd instructed you.
Okay.
Your right hand only. Are you ready?
Ready.
Okay, go. I did not expect to find significant or dramatic health problems when we went out there. It just seemed incomprehensible to me that there could be a toxin suddenly appearing in estuary waterways that could suddenly start making people ill.
In the end, the impairments they were displaying were so profound, she spent nearly 2 hours with each patient.
I was in a state of considerable disbelief. To have something so clear and striking and consistent amongst an entire group of people was pretty remarkable. The people who had been exposed to the waterways to a significant degree were suffering from significant problems in new learning and memory.
After 10 days of testing, the panel met to discuss their initial findings.
You got 13 people, and just about everybody has some kind of skin problem. There were some on the feet, some on the hands, and some on the trunk. So
interesting. But their stories were quite amazing. Confusion and memory problems. So I'm really curious what Lynn was able to measure, because from an internal...
The panel compared the Pocomoke cases to a sampling of average watermen.
Okay, Let me start out by just passing out a brief preliminary.
Dr. Grattan documented the waterman's symptoms. Her research showed that people exposed to affected waters had a whole range of cognitive difficulties.
Findings essentially demonstrated that the impairment was in this compartment of memory, the element of memory that is involved in new learning. They were able to learn material at a much slower rate than age and education compare normals or non-exposed individuals. The deficit was pretty significant, and this probably explains why they're complaining of confusion. They're not taking in.
This was not a hysterical reaction. This was something very real, and there was something very real and very strange that was going on in the brains of these individuals. These are the PET scans?
Right.
The medical team prepared their report for the Maryland State Health Department. They didn't mince words.
As you can see here, there's some hypermetabolic activity outlined in the bright yellow in this group compared to the control group. Now,
they finally had strong indicators that exposure to the river caused problems with learning and memory. What they didn't know was how they could combat it.
What we have here is still a mystery. We don't know what's going on with these people, but the data that we have say that there's something real that's happening.
one of the things I'm not comfortable with is
All they knew was that the problems originated on the waterways.
We're going to have people out there on that river, and are we comfortable with people having continued exposure to the river based on what we're seeing with these findings? We need to get the State Health Department into this and go to the governor.
You know, the governor's ready to close the river if you give him the red light and tell him to.
Yes, under those circumstances, from a public health standpoint, we got to shut down the river.
The governor had only one choice, and he acted swiftly. For the first time in Maryland history, he ordered the Pocomoke River closed. No one knew exactly when it would open again, or if they would ever be able to help the people who were falling ill. After a deadly microbe invaded Maryland waterways and people began getting sick, in 1997, the governor moved quickly to close the Pocomoke River. He wasn't taking any chances.
It moved it from being a local fish kill problem to a problem that potentially threatened human life, human health.
At the National Institute of Environment Health Sciences in North Carolina, leading scientists also gathered to compare research on the toxin.
Lots of state officials from Maryland convened there along with fishermen and some of the local physicians and certain scientists who were invited up to try to shed light on the issue. And all of us got together and presented data or ideas and hashed over what we thought might be going on that was causing the fish disease.
The key question for scientists: what had happened to trigger the illnesses? Normally, Pfiesteria occur naturally in waterways and aren't a problem. But something had allowed the microbes to grow rapidly and out of control. The scientists at the summit theorized that the increased Pfiesteria levels were a direct result of increased nutrients in the water. Much of it potentially caused by animal waste products washing into the rivers and upsetting the natural balance. The waste runoff in North Carolina rivers was so extreme that it could be seen from space.
The amount of manure produced by swine in North Carolina is the equivalent, it's considered, of all the sewage from the people of California and New York in combination.
North Carolina officials decided to close the infected Neuse River. Meanwhile, the Maryland State Legislature took the strongest action of any state, passing the Clean Water Act of 1998 in direct response to the Pfiesteria infestation of the Chesapeake waterways.
Miners used to take canaries into the mine
and if there was bad gas there, the canary would die, and the miners give them time to escape that mine before the gas killed everyone. I think the Pfiesteria is like the canaries of years past. It is a clear signal that we have exceeded pollution levels beyond what is reasonable, beyond what nature can tolerate in our water. And it is an implication to us that we've got to do something about this.
Mr. Benton's ready.
How's he doing?
His memory's not very good today.
Okay, thanks.
While lawmakers grappled with how best to handle the situation, doctors like Richie Shoemaker were still dealing with dozens of patients who were suffering.
What's going on? Yeah, we got to touch of the Alzheimer's.
What do you mean?
As he began seeing more and more patients, Dr. Shoemaker played a hunch. He decided to try cholestyramine, a powerful anti-cholesterol drug that works by attaching itself to harmful cholesterol and carrying it out of the patient's system.
Cholestyramine has been used for many toxicologic problems in the past. It's one of the few things that binds dioxins. It binds chlorothalonils. It binds DDT, for goodness sake, PCBs. It binds toxins.
How long has this been going on?
Dr. Shoemaker's guess was right. The drug proved so successful that the first 3 Pfiesteria patients who received it were symptom-free in 3 days. Shoemaker found that the drug had to be administered shortly after the Pfiesteria exposure began to be effective. It worked best for limited exposures. Three months after she first saw her original 13 patients, neuropsychologist Dr. Lynn Gratton conducted a follow-up exam to check their cognitive function.
Okay, now can you tell me as many words as you can from that set?
Yeah, let's see, fact.
11 had recovered to near normal levels. 2, who possibly had the highest degree of Pfiesteria exposure, remained severely impaired.
Good, you seem to be doing very well. How are you feeling?
A lot better, much better.
Today, the Pfiesteria outbreak has emerged as a highly public health issue. As this vicious microbe intensifies its assault, at the National Ocean Service Lab in Charleston, South Carolina, Dr. John Ramsdell continues his work to find a way to control the Pfiesteria. His team is trying to create a marker so that health officials can identify Pfiesteria toxin in the water. In the lab, the eerie green glow of a Pfiesteria sample means success. Dr. Ramsdell and Dr. Moeller have combined a gene from a firefly and that of a human to create a marker gene that glows green in the presence of Pfiesteria toxin.
When these cells respond to the toxin, they turn on the firefly luciferase gene, making all the enzyme that gives them the capacity to make light. So hence these cells become almost like little flashlights in response to the toxin. Instead of going through a biochemical change that leads to cell toxicity, they go through a biochemical change that generates light.
But for researcher Howard Glasgow at the North Carolina Aquatics Lab, all of the research may come too late. His condition continues to deteriorate. He has developed shakes, a numbing in his arms and legs, and a progressive degeneration of his spinal cord.
If uncorrected and we're unable to control this, then eventually it will get to the point where I'll be completely paralyzed because of the area in which my demyelinating or nerve degeneration problem is occurring on my spinal cord. Certainly I have a personal investment associated with understanding the mode of action of the Pfiesteria toxin. We need to know more about how it affects the brain, how it can be useful in understanding Alzheimer's-like symptoms, neurodegenerative diseases such as multiple sclerosis, all of which in combination with one another, have presented in my situation and others that have been exposed to Pfiesteria.
This is about an Alexandrium toxin that I'm checking into. Thanks.
Dr. Joanne Burkholder herself has also suffered significant exposure to Pfiesteria. She still battles with chronic bronchitis, yet she continues her work with the toxin.
The only reason that I stayed working on Pfiesteria was because of Howard's health. Only reason that I stayed after the 1997 outbreaks in Maryland, stayed in North Carolina, was to see through to the end, getting this toxin characterized, to see if there was anything that could be done to help Howard.
Scientists have yet to develop a test to detect the Pfiesteria toxin in human blood. For now, medical scientists are calling the health effect estuary-associated syndrome.
So open your mouth a little bit for me, about like that, good.
The testing continues, while there is still debate on whether Pfiesteria is truly the cause of these symptoms.
The signs and symptoms are so nonspecific that they may be mimicked by other very common illnesses. We will not know the answer until effective tests for the toxin are developed. And I think the prudent thing to do in the meantime is don't eat fish with lesions and don't be around fish kills.
Have it lying down here for me, please.
For physicians like Richie Shoemaker, the obvious symptoms can't be overlooked.
Take any one person's word for a claim. It has to stand up.
Have you found some fish with lesions, Mom?
Other people need to see it. And skepticism is right. But skepticism in the face of obvious abnormalities is inappropriate.
Look at the condition of them, the coloration. They're supposed to be white and clean, and they are brown and full of toxins.
Those who suffer symptoms from possible Pfiesteria exposure, like fishermen Seth Willis and David Jones, don't need experts to tell them the effects of Pfiesteria are real. As David Jones's health is degenerated, he can no longer work on the water. The toxin has taken away the only life he has ever known.
I spent a lifetime to build a business, and it was taken away from me. You feel like you are a burden on someone else, and it's not a very pleasant feeling.
As scientists grapple with understanding this mysterious organism, David Jones only longs for the day when he has a clear mind and clear water in which to fish. A small town becomes a death zone. A lethal bacteria is loose, and it preys upon young children. Parents are in anguish. Doctors are powerless to stop it. As hospitals fill with the sick and dying, health officials search for the source of the killer. Terrified parents can only wonder, is my child next? Some of the names in this program have been changed. It was the middle of the night, May 18th, 2000. 8-year-old Allison Taylor was sick, and she was getting worse by the minute. Mary Taylor rushed her daughter to Owen Sound Hospital in Ontario, Canada.
I know, sweetie, I know. I'm trying to hurry.
For days, Allison had complained of flu symptoms. Now, she was in excruciating pain. Mary was afraid she'd made a terrible mistake by not bringing her daughter to the hospital sooner.
Could I get you to help me, please? Or put her down in the garden.
Allison was burning with fever. She was so dehydrated, she was too weak to hold her head up. The ER paged the hospital's pediatric specialist.
And how long has she had these symptoms?
It's been going on for several days, and I thought it would go away. It's getting worse, I think.
Hi, I'm Dr. Howard.
Allison's symptoms were severe.
What are you feeling right now? What's hurting?
Stomach's hurting.
Your stomach's hurting? And I'm gonna press on some spots in your stomach and you tell me if it hurts, okay? I'm gonna start right here, right here.
Ow, that hurts.
It's kind of tender. What about down here?
Acute abdominal pain could indicate the presence of a massive infection. As an experienced pediatrician, Dr. Hallett proceeded with caution. She would treat the dehydration and fever with fluids and anti-fever medication.
She's been having diarrhea pretty bad, the stomach cramps, fever.
The initial treatment for vomiting diarrhea is generally to treat them with supportive treatment. The idea is that your body is vomiting and having diarrhea generally for a purpose. Your body's trying to get rid of a toxin, they're trying to get rid of a bacteria.
Mary had not given Allison any anti-diarrheal medication. It was a good decision, according to Dr. Hallett.
It's generally recommended that you don't give them anything to stop the diarrhea, particularly because then you're actually keeping the bacteria within the gut even longer, and then you may increase your risk of having complications.
Dr. Hallett was worried. Allison's severe dehydration could have serious consequences.
I think we need to admit her.
Okay.
Okay?
Hallett wanted to monitor her symptoms. Allison was transferred to the pediatric intensive care unit. There, she was given fluids intravenously. Vomiting and diarrhea had depleted the child's body of water and minerals. Without them, her heart struggled to pump blood to her vital organs. Allison's fluids had to be replenished. Otherwise, her organs would fail and she would die. Dehydration is very dangerous in small children. The doctors could prescribe antibiotics, but until they knew exactly what they were dealing with, it could be ineffective or even dangerous.
Antibiotics aren't generally recommended until you've actually determined the type of bug that's causing the diarrhea, because there always is a risk that you could make things worse.
Some bacteria, when killed by antibiotics, will release deadly toxins.
And so you really felt that there's so much you'd like to be able to help with, but you couldn't do.
She has been complaining of pain.
As the hours passed, Allison's condition deteriorated. She had developed blood in her stool, and her temperature was climbing.
Complaining of a lot of pain.
She is, and she's been real restless and has been unable to sleep, so she's been...
Then Dr. Hallett received alarming news about another child in the ICU.
The Thomas boys developed blood in his stool.
Okay, let's order a stool sample for her, all right?
Hallett sensed she was dealing with something out of the ordinary. She was more right than she knew. 9-year-old Jack Thomas's symptoms were identical to Allison's. His severe diarrhea left him listless and dehydrated. The cases were too similar. For doctors who treat infectious diseases, even small coincidences set off alarm bells.
I started to wonder if there was a link between the two kids. And you don't usually see two people with bloody diarrhea within one day.
Bloody diarrhea was an unusual symptom and an important clue. Intestinal bleeding is often the sign of an infection caused by a virus, a parasite, or a foodborne bacteria. To determine if it was a bacteria, stool samples were placed in a culture medium. an environment where bacteria will readily grow. The cultures would need to incubate for over 24 hours. For the doctors and staff at Owen Sound Hospital, the wait was endless. They had 2 desperately sick children to care for. Doctors feared it was a dangerous infection. Hallett was candid with the parents. She told them that some children with these symptoms develop kidney failure, a condition that can lead to death. The parents were terrified.
It was really at that time that I had concern that this was a much larger outbreak. I also recognize that it's the public health's job to get in there right away and to determine the source of the infection.
At the Public Health Unit, Bev Middleton launched an investigation. She suspected the children had eaten contaminated food. She called the private school in Walkerton, where both Allison and Jack were enrolled.
I wonder if you could help me out. Have you seen any increase in your absenteeism?
She asked if the school served lunches. It did not.
Any community events, any school functions?
She then searched for anything else the 2 children might have in common.
I was looking for an event that might have taken place at the school, a common food source, a common food event that would have exposed these 2 children. There had been no common function at the school.
Then she uncovered the beginning of a public health nightmare.
They had about 25 children who were ill, and 4 more had become ill at school and had been sent home.
The school nurse was overwhelmed. A total of 29 children had been stricken with stomach cramps, diarrhea, and vomiting. It was an ominous sign. That many cases could mean only one thing. They were facing a dangerous epidemic, and it was spreading quickly.
I'll be following up.
Middleton called every school in Walkerton. She learned that a quarter of the students at the public elementary school were also sick. There were no reports of illness among Walkerton's junior high and high school students. An infection was rampant in the school system. But it was only targeting the town's youngest children, for now.
The Walkerton Hospital had seen 8 patients. All were experiencing a 3-day history of diarrhea with an onset of bloody diarrhea, which prompted the parents to bring the children into the emergency department.
Middleton knew that a biological predator was loose somewhere in Walkerton. She didn't know that it was just the beginning. Across town at the Maple Court Retirement Villa, an unusual number of residents were getting sick. Worried staff nurses advised Joanne Todd, the administrator of the facility.
By Friday afternoon, we had 3 residents with the same symptoms. Our policies dictate that we go to outbreak procedures, which means that we then contact the health unit and advise them that we have 3 residents ill with the same symptoms, and it could possibly be indicative of an outbreak situation.
The elderly residents had developed the same symptoms at the same time as the children. It was an unusual development and an important clue.
Children and the elderly do not eat the same types of foods. We were looking at common events, things that would bring these 2 populations together.
Middleton looked back to try and identify when the patients had gotten sick.
We were looking at what happened on the weekend prior to that. Of course, it was Mother's Day weekend, which would have lots of visitation to both the nursing homes and to local restaurants, influx of people into the community as well.
If a restaurant in Walkerton had served tainted food over the holiday weekend, hundreds of people could be infected. By Saturday morning, cultures taken from the sick children had incubated for over 24 hours. they were covered with bacterial growth. Scientists now had to determine the type of bacteria. A sample from the culture was treated with a reagent solution. If the paper turned blue, it would identify the bacteria. The results confirmed the doctor's worst fears. The children were infected with E. coli 0157, a deadly bacteria. E. coli multiplies with breathtaking speed. One cell becomes 1 trillion in 24 hours. The bacteria is also armed with a deadly weapon. It releases a toxic poison that attacks the cells of the intestine and causes bleeding. The invisible menace is taken very seriously by health officials like Dr. Murray McQuigg.
It produces probably one of the most deadly poisons on the planet because it just takes a little bit to make people terribly ill. The unique thing about E. coli 0157 is that most of the toxin is produced in peaks early. In other words, by the time you get diarrhea, you may be in big trouble already.
For these children and their parents, it was a terrifying diagnosis. There is no known cure for E. coli 0157. The bacteria is a notorious killer. In 1993, an outbreak in Seattle, Washington, infected 700 people and killed 4 children. The source was contaminated ground beef served by a popular fast food chain.
95% of E. coli 0157 in North America's foodborne. Now, it's called hamburger disease for a good reason, because ground hamburger is often the source of this if it's not cooked properly.
In Walkerton, health officials contacted every patient to find out what they had eaten over the past 4 days.
You can ask if there's any common thread that goes through those people that have that symptom. Were they out at a church barbecue, for instance? Were they attending a school function where undercooked hamburgers were served? So you can go through a checklist of questions, which they did, to try and narrow down, were the majority of these people at the same place eating the same food?
But none of the patients had eaten at the same place. They were back to square one. They had no idea where the E. coli was coming from. And patients kept coming. On Friday evening, 7-year-old Stephanie Martin was rushed to Walkerton Hospital. She was in critical condition. Until officials could find the source of the deadly outbreak, the children of Walkerton, as well as the very old, were all potential victims. In the spring of 2000, an epidemic ravaged a small town in Ontario, Canada. Health officials were in a panic. They couldn't find the source of the deadly E. coli bacteria. Children and the elderly were struck down by the illness. When 7-year-old Stephanie Martin arrived in the emergency room, she was barely conscious. Because there is no cure for E. coli, doctors could only treat her symptoms. The little girl was dangerously dehydrated. Her case was the worst they had seen by far. Before she was brought to the hospital, she had been given medication to stop her diarrhea. The toxic infection was now trapped in her body, increasing the danger of complications. By Saturday morning, the 3rd day of the outbreak, the Walkerton healthcare system was completely overwhelmed. Every hour, more patients arrived in the emergency room. As a public health investigator, Bev Middleton was alarmed.
When I called the Walkerton Hospital for an update, I was advised that they had seen another 20 patients in their emergency department, 10 children, 10 adults.
By day 3 of the outbreak, doctors had seen 40 patients. The E. coli was not just attacking the young and the old. The disease was infecting every age group.
You have the new cases?
Yes. Using patient information, health officials tracked the spread of the outbreak. All the patients lived in Walkerton, but there were no other obvious links between them, and no common food sources listed in their 4-day eating histories. Saturday afternoon, the outbreak took an even more terrifying turn. Cases from areas outside Walkerton began arriving at the hospital. The epidemic was spreading fast. 4-year-old Molly Glass was from Hanover, a town nearby. She was suffering from stomach cramps, vomiting, and diarrhea.
We were getting quite concerned. We had cases in Hanover and other places in our district, and we wondered if, in fact, the problem was in Walkerton or someplace else that we'd missed.
When doctors questioned Molly's parents, the trail of evidence led them right back to where they started.
We were able to determine that the family had gone to Walkerton on May 14th for Mother's Day dinner, and they had a 1-day exposure to Walkerton.
The source of the outbreak must be in Walkerton, but McQuigg now suspected it was not food-related.
We'd looked hard for a possible food source for this. There just wasn't one. So if there isn't one, and we were convinced of that, we said to ourselves, what else can it be? It's across a broad range of ages and people in Walkerton. Food doesn't usually do that.
McQuigg looked for a geographical connection. His investigators used patient addresses to see if the outbreak was centered in one part of town.
We had a map of Walkerton, and with a yellow highlighter, we started to highlight the streets. By the end of the day, that map of Walkerton was one big mass of yellow highlighter. In other words, we knew by then that this had hit the whole town, and there's only one thing can do that. That's not food, that's water.
From a public health perspective, it was a disaster in the making. Dr. McQuigg knew that if E. coli was in Walkerton's water, every single one of its citizens was at risk.
You didn't have to be a wizard to understand that 5 to 10% of people that got sick would develop kidney failure. So in a town of 4,800, we started doing the math, and we knew that in the next few days people would die almost certainly of this disease.
McQuigg contacted the PUC, the Public Utilities Commission. It was their job to test the town's water supply on a weekly basis. A review of their records showed no abnormalities over the last 6 months. Chlorine levels were normal, and there had been no report of bacterial growth. McQuigg was surprised and suspicious. Water was the only logical answer.
The PUC, who does the sampling and sends them off for tests, says the water's okay. So we had a debate about whether we should take our own water samples.
Facing an outbreak of this magnitude, the health unit had to be sure. Investigators collected water samples from 22 different sources throughout Walkerton. McQuigg was not hopeful.
We thought, it's probably been a week and a half since this thing actually happened. What are the chances of us finding the bug in the water? We thought very little.
It was a long shot, but they were desperate for answers. It would take 24 hours to get lab results. But before they had their answer, the outbreak claimed its first victim. A 66-year-old woman died of complications. Friends and neighbors grieved for the family. But panic was spreading.
The first death occurred that only heightens everyone's anxiety. The parents, the kids, the doctors and nurses, and everyone.
Walkerton's grief was not private as the media learned of the tragedy. The outbreak became international news. Dozens of people were now infected. And still the source of the disease was a mystery. In the town of Walkerton, only two things were certain. They were at war with an invisible killer, and the death toll would rise. In Ontario, Canada, a little girl was suffering from severe stomach cramps. She was diagnosed with a lethal bacteria, E. coli 0157. It was the beginning of a deadly epidemic. With hospitals overwhelmed, doctors were desperate. Terror gripped the community. Until health officials found the source of the epidemic, the whole town was threatened. They believed the town's water supply was to blame, but public utility records showed it was safe. Dr. Murray McQuigg suspected somebody was lying.
We simply didn't believe what we were being told by the waterworks operators, and we were in a position of saying, yes, we should issue a boil water advisory, even though we're being told by the very people that test it that it's okay. So it was a difficult thing to do.
Radio, the time is 7 o'clock.
It was a risky move, but McQuigg was willing to stake his career on it.
Expect some lows in the low 50s.
He issued a warning to the public through local radio stations.
Bruce Gray Owentown Health Unit has issued a boil water advisory for all Walkerton residents. Medical Officer of Health Dr. Murray McQuigg says close to 100 people have called the Walkerton Hospital complaining of diarrhea. Again, the Bruce Gray Owentown Health Unit is asking all Walkerton residents to boil water before being used for drinking and cooking. The Gray Bruce Regional Health
With the news their water could be fatal, residents of Walkerton panicked. Area schools turned off their drinking fountains. Parents were terrified. A swimming pool or even a puddle of water were potentially deadly. As a public health investigator, Bev Middleton urged calm, but preached caution.
The feeling in the community was of anger, an awful lot of panic, and certainly of fear.
The public health unit instructed Walkerton residents to shut off the water in their homes. Every faucet was a possible source of infection. All water had to be boiled for drinking, bathing, and washing the dishes. E. coli takes 2 to 4 days to show symptoms. Residents like Bruce Davidson waited in fear, hoping his family wasn't already infected.
You're searching at this point for some reason why it won't touch your family. So absolute fear was gripping people because they knew that there was, at this point, an incubation period, and am I sitting on a time bomb that's going to get me in 3 or 4 days?
As news spread all over Canada, Walkerton became a ghost town. The schools were closed. Restaurants and businesses shut their doors.
People didn't want to come to Walkerton to eat or shop. Some Walkerton citizens, when they went to other towns, were shunned. They thought in some way that they were contaminated.
Despite the hardship, the community rallied together. Grocery store owners donated thousands of gallons of bottled water to Walkerton residents. On top of dealing with sick friends and relatives, residents coped with the challenges of life without running water.
Everything you can think of that involved water was an ordeal. Shaving in the morning, boiling water on the stove to do that because you wouldn't want to use the tap water and nick yourself and then put that into your system.
Everyday tasks became more difficult and anxiety-provoking.
You didn't dare put small children in the bathtub because you thought, what if they get a sip of the water? Is the water okay? Don't want to take that chance.
For those who were already sick, every hour was a struggle. The infection was painful, and there was no cure. Allison Taylor was one of the first victims of the outbreak. It had been 3 days since she was admitted into ICU, and her condition was still deteriorating. There was nothing Dr. Hallett could do.
It was probably the most stressful for the parents of the children who were sick because there wasn't a real quick end in sight, and many people had several children that were unwell, and to have the risk of one child being sick is bad enough, but to have more than one, that was very anxiety-provoking.
At Owen Sound Hospital, little Molly Glass was one of the youngest patients struck down by E. coli. Just 4 years of age, she was especially vulnerable to the poisonous bacteria. Blood tests revealed Molly's fragile kidneys were beginning to fail. She showed signs of HUS, hemolytic uremic syndrome. The life-threatening complication was attacking her kidneys. Molly needed dialysis. She had to be transferred to a larger facility. Her doctor decided to airlift her to a children's hospital in London, Ontario. For a child this ill, the 3-hour journey was risky, but it was her only chance for survival. Dialysis was the only weapon doctors had to fight the HUS and to keep her kidneys working. But Molly's prognosis was not good. The tiny girl was in a fight for her life. Her parents were in anguish. As more young children became sick, Dr. McQuigg was in a desperate race to protect other families from suffering the same fate.
I called every parent that had a child under the age of 5 because those are the kids that are likely to die if they get hemolytic uremic syndrome or kidney failure from this.
He told parents to take their children to the hospital for blood tests every 2 days.
It must have been terrible to hear my voice on the phone saying that your child may develop kidney failure. I should tell you that every one of those parents was grateful for the call, and they did not get angry, they did not get terribly upset. They were glad to have the information.
The community rallied around its children, who were hit hardest by the outbreak. By now, the Walkerton Hospital was filled to overflowing.
Every seat in the emergency room at different times was filled with people slumped over in their chairs with severe abdominal cramping, parents holding children. You have never seen the look of fear and terror on the pale face of a parent as they sit there with their child saying, is this going to be minor or is this going to take the life of my child? It was just too horrible.
For parents and doctors alike, the news just kept getting worse.
The stress for the doctors was equally felt by the nurses and the lab techs and the pathologists and public health, everyone who was kind of involved with the epidemic.
Though the tragedy in Walkerton had captured the attention of the world, there was still no proof the water was the source.
When are we going to get a straight answer on what's happening to our children in this town?
Colin Perkle covered the story for the Toronto Star.
And arrived to find a community in shock, in chaos, confusion. People were sick, people were dying. They were trying to get answers from their local politicians. Nobody was providing the answers.
By day 4 of the outbreak, over 100 people were infected. The most critical patients were airlifted to London, Ontario. Stephanie Martin was another severe case. She joined a ward full of patients from Walkerton. They were all in critical condition. The 7-year-old's kidneys were failing. Doctors rushed to prep her for dialysis. On Tuesday, the health unit received lab results on water samples they had taken 24 hours earlier. Of 22 samples, 2 tested positive for E. coli.
We were stunned. I don't mean to be too dramatic, but we were stunned. There was complete silence in the room. It took us seconds to understand that we were not being told the truth about Walkerton's water.
The Public Utilities Commission had failed to protect the town's water supply. Worse, they had hidden their own negligence. Now, dozens of children were at risk of paying for that mistake with their lives. In May of 2000, Walkerton, Ontario was a town under siege. They were at war with a deadly outbreak. Hundreds of people were sick, and some of them were dying. Lab results revealed that their homes and the town they lived in were contaminated by a deadly bacteria. E. coli 0157 was in Walkerton's water supply. It was everywhere. As a health official, Dr. Murray McQuigg knew what was coming, and it scared him.
By the time our public health unit gets confirmation of a water test that's bad, it's too late. People have already consumed the water, and we know that we are in a situation where we're really reacting to a problem that's already started. It was like looking into a crystal ball and predicting a catastrophe.
E. coli bacteria spreads like wildfire. It threatened to consume the whole town. McQuigg was shocked to learn the Public Utilities Commission had lied. They endangered an entire town by failing to chlorinate the tap water.
They'd already had tests back showing that their water was contaminated and didn't tell us, and that they'd had a chlorinator off of one of the 3 wells for some time. At that time, we didn't know for how long.
On May 23rd, 5 days into the epidemic, Dr. McQuigg went public with his findings.
On Friday, May the 19th of last week, the Bruce Grey Owen Sound Public Health Unit was notified. We held a press conference on Tuesday to tell people that there was a disaster occurring in Walkerton and the kinds of precautions that we needed people to take. It was critically important to get that information out as soon as we could to as many people as we could.
People all over the country were stunned by the news, but the residents of Walkerton felt betrayed.
I was completely overwhelmed. I mean, we all know that third world countries have this happen all the time, but I really felt that our water here was safe.
On Saturday, when we saw a whole raft of people with bloody diarrhea.
Something as innocuous as drinking water was tearing their town apart.
It was a tremendous mixture of shock, anger, fear of what the future would hold, because the system that we'd put so much faith in, nothing is more essential than the air you breathe and the water you drink. You take it for granted.
The government sent in a team to take over the public utilities and to probe the extent of their deadly mistake.
And the investigation must be allowed to continue so the full scope of the problem can be identified and dealt with.
It would take time to fix Walkerton's water problem. How long, they didn't know. A black veil fell over the town as the E. coli epidemic held residents in its deadly grip.
Beautiful spring days, where you usually would see the children running and playing and spraying each other with garden hose and laughing and all kinds of activity that's normal, was absolutely like a bomb had gone off. There were no children on the street. The children that were well enough to be sent away to stay with grandparents out of town were sent away. Some were in hospital, some were struggling with the illness themselves.
Nurse! Nurse!
At an Ontario hospital, Molly Glass's condition went from bad to worse. As her body struggled against the bacteria's toxin, her arteries collapsed. Molly suffered multiple strokes. There was nothing doctors could do to save her life. The outbreak claimed its second victim, 4-year-old Molly Glass.
An update on the E. coli outbreak in Walkerton. We just learned a young Hanover girl has died from complications from the bacterial infection. The child had been in
For
Walkerton
residents, it was frightening news. Molly and her family had only been in Walkerton for a single day.
That increased the fear even more, because the idea that you didn't have to live here and consume the water for long periods of time, that what would seem like a minimal exposure to this water could be lethal. And you turn to your own children and you look at them and you just want to hug them, and you start running through your mind, when was the last time my children had access to this water?
The sound of ambulances were a common and terrifying reminder. Nobody was safe from the outbreak. Health officials worked around the clock trying to contain the epidemic.
People were scared. We talked about the kinds of things that the public needed to be told in order to protect those that hadn't gotten sick already, about washing their hands in chlorine after they went to the washroom, and all those kinds of safeguards to try and ensure that more people didn't get sick.
The health unit educated doctors on the most recent treatments for E. coli.
We become the repository of new medical information, if you will. Lots of physicians don't know much about E. coli 015787. We look up the latest treatments. We give them the tests that they need to do.
An E. coli epidemic of this size had never been seen in North America. Close to 1,000 people were now infected. 5 to 10% of them would develop kidney failure.
We started to worry whether there'd be enough kidney dialysis machines in Ontario with the numbers that we thought would get sick.
As the outbreak grew, more and more of Walkerton's sick were medevaced to London, Ontario.
So every resident of our community hears that helicopter come in. You'd break out into a cold sweat because you thought, who is it now? It's coming to take someone away. It was the equivalent of watching a hearse drive past your door every few hours.
The hospital in London, Ontario was jammed. They had a ward full of patients from Walkerton. They were all in critical condition and on dialysis. For some, the dialysis came too late. 5 days into the crisis, the outbreak took its third victim, an 83-year-old grandmother. Before the epidemic ran its course, how many more of their friends, their neighbors, and their children would die? A deadly outbreak of E. coli 0157 had ravaged a small town in Ontario, Canada. For health officials, it was a public health nightmare. 3 people had died. Over 1,000 were infected. The most critical patients were airlifted to a larger hospital in a nearby city. Lab results had proven that Walkerton's tap water was contaminated by deadly E. coli bacteria. The health unit issued an advisory to the public. The drinking water was potentially fatal. Bottled water was brought in by the truckload. Citizens worked together to deal with the crisis as the media recorded their every move.
The news was going very quickly all across the province, all across Canada, all across the world for that matter, about this outbreak. Downtown was just a complete throng of media trucks lining the main street, satellite trucks from every network you can imagine.
As the world watched, Walkerton's grief turned to rage.
We are a small town. We have dealt with death. We continually deal with people, neighbors, friends who are hurt, who are sick, and hopefully will not follow through with that tragedy. So my question is...
They demanded an explanation for how a thing like this could happen in their town. The government launched a comprehensive water testing program in and around Walkerton. They started with the town's water wells. One of them, well number 5, was located near a small farm. Nearby groundwater tested positive for E. coli. But this well had been operational for years. Why did the contamination suddenly occur? Investigators worked backwards, looking at Mother's Day weekend, 5 days before the first case was reported. Heavy rains had swept through the area. Much of the town was flooded. E. coli bacteria in cow manure was swept from flooded pastures into the groundwater and then into the nearby well. This would not have caused a problem had the water supply been properly chlorinated. Tragically, the chlorinator on a single well was not working. Lack of maintenance and incomplete testing allowed a deadly bacteria to flourish and enter the town's drinking water.
None of them at the Public Utilities Commission had been doing what they were supposed to be doing. They hadn't been following the guidelines that were in place. They hadn't been testing the water properly.
Now it would take a massive cleanup effort to decontaminate the town's water supply. But they had to make Walkerton safe again. It was a huge undertaking. Town water systems were flushed with chlorine to purge the bacteria. All the pipes in each house had to be individually disinfected.
So they went through some 800 households, super chlorinating the pipes, waiting for that chlorine to sit for a day, testing that system afterwards.
The cleanup was crucial, but highly disruptive. Many residents simply gave up and left town until they could be sure the water was safe. In time, at the hospitals in Walkerton and London, Ontario, the infection finally ran its course. Jack Thomas and Allison Taylor were released from the hospital. For Stephanie Martin, recovery was slow but steady. After weeks in the hospital, she would soon go home. Many children who develop kidney problems will suffer lingering effects for the rest of their lives. Nearly half of Walkerton's 4,800 residents became ill as a result of the outbreak. 7 people lost their lives. Their suffering has become a lasting part of the town's history.
One woman I spoke to compared it to the Second World War, the feeling in the town. And that struck me, how devastating this was for this town, that it had evoked for her that same kind of emotion.
It was 7 months before Walkerton's water was considered safe for public consumption.
So I'll come right to the point. We're going to lift the boil water advisory for Walkerton today.
Today, clean water in Walkerton is never taken for granted. Bruce Davidson formed Concerned Citizens for Walkerton, a group committed to protecting the region's fragile environment.
We want to change our legacy from one of infamy to one of excellence, and tell people that even though something terrible happens to you, you can move ahead, and you have to move ahead, because if the deaths of those people from E. coli are going to mean anything, we have to continue to move ahead and set a good example for the rest of the world.
A fountain in Walkerton memorializes those who lost their lives in the epidemic. It is also a monument to the fearless doctors and health officials who joined forces to stop a ruthless killer and end a biological catastrophe.